Hello. Today we're going to be looking at the end of empire in the 20th century, but we'll also be taking a look at the ways in which the United States heavily influenced this period for good and bad. Just as a reference, we want to take a look briefly at this map so we can see what colonial possessions the European countries still had as of the end of the Second World War. And we'll begin our examination of this process in South Asia. Although most of this presentation deals with the period after the Second World War, to understand India, we actually have to go back quite a few decades before World War II. And we have to start with a historical figure that I'm sure all of you have heard of before, named Mohandas Gandhi. Now, oftentimes you will hear him referred to as Mahatma Gandhi or the Mahatma, and that just means wise soul. He was a British trained lawyer who practiced in South Africa for 20 years. There was a large Indian minority in South Africa. One of the consequences of decades of the British Empire is you had a tendency to have people from different colonial possessions emigrating to different places within the British Empire, and Gandhi was one of those people. He supported India's participation in the First World War. We know from having looked at that war that there were a large number of colonial troops for all of the European powers. A lot of Indians fought in World War I. And Gandhi kind of assumed that India would be rewarded with self-government, particularly after all of the rhetoric of the Treaty of Versailles, that how people had a basic right to self-determination. But we also know, as a practical matter, that that did not apply to non-white countries, right? And so Britain did not demonstrate any interest whatsoever in allowing India to have more self-government. So Gandhi returns to India and decides to travel across the country dressed as a peasant. He was a very middle-class, well-educated guy, because he wanted to understand the plight of the poor, right? So that classic image that you see below of Gandhi, that was a little bit of an affectation on his part to be able to better understand his fellow Indians. He saw lots of mistreatment by the British, and as a result, he organized strikes and nonviolent protests. There was one in 1919 called the Amritsar Massacre, in which 400 nonviolent protesters were killed. And that really showed Indian people that the Brits were not going to just walk away voluntarily from India. And as a consequence, now you have more Indian people who are favoring full independence. Due to that massacre, they now recognize the need to have their own independent nation. Gandhi pioneered the whole concept of nonviolent protest. That is a model that gets duplicated in a lot of other independence and civil rights movements, including that of the United States. Martin Luther King adopted many of Gandhi's strategies, which would include things like boycotts. The Indians boycotted British products and British businesses, and they refused to purchase cotton goods from Britain. They would only purchase Indian-produced cotton products, textiles, clothing, that sort of thing. Throughout the 1920s, there were protests in favor of independence. You have very common, you have strikes and demonstrations and more boycotts, and you have millions and millions of Indians who were supporting this movement. The British understandably saw that as a threat. They frequently referred to India as being like the jewel of the empire, like the most important colony that the British Empire had. And so they weren't going to take any uh, real concerted efforts to gain independence, and as a result, they threw Gandhi in jail for several years in the 1920s. They released him. He was a good boy for a little while, but then he started agitating against a salt tax, and he led a protest down to the shoreline and encouraged people to just pick up chunks of salt in areas where the water was low, and he got thrown in jail again in the 1930s. The 1930s were a tumultuous period in India. If you recall from a previous lecture, there was an organization called the Indian National Congress that was created in the 1880s, and originally it was for all Indian people. It wasn't divided by religion, but some Muslims started to have concerns about the interests of their fellow Muslims, and they were a little concerned about what the Hindu majority in India might do. And that led this individual named Muhammad Ali Jinnah to form a rival to the Indian National Congress called the Muslim League. And you can tell by its name that it was religious based. Jinnah was British educated. You can see him there in the image on the right. He was secular, so he was not a religious guy. And he didn't even speak Urdu, which is the dominant language in the areas of India that were majority Muslim. And so, he didn't really have a connection to the Muslim people of India, although he was nominally one of them. He was someone who was looking for political power. That's really the driving force for Jinnah, as you will see as we go along. Once Jinnah broke away from the Indian National Congress, that left a guy named Jawaharlal Nehru, and we won't need to say his first name again because everyone just knows him as Nehru. And that led him to become the political leader of the Indian National Congress, and you can see him there on the left in that image. Gandhi was sort of the spiritual leader of the movement, but he wasn't involved in like the day-to-day operations of this political party known as the INC. So the independence movement continues throughout the 1930s. The British acquiesced in 37 and allowed for local elections, so local Indian leaders are allowed to have some political power. The Indian National Congress swept those elections, including in the areas that were majority Muslim. So there wasn't a lot of popular support for the Muslim League. This was sort of Muhammad Ali Jinnah's way to try to gain political power. As World War II approached, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused to consider any calls for independence. His position is that it was the duty of the British Empire to defeat fascism first before having any conversations about independence. Nehru continued to lead protests against Britain and got thrown in jail also. And once Nehru was in jail, that gave Jinnah the opportunity to start working the Brits to try to get a separate Muslim state. For all practical purposes, everyone understood that independence for India was coming. It was just a question of when it actually got here. And Jinnah was making his move for a separate Muslim state that, of course, he would be in charge of. As a result, you start to get real conflict between Hindus and Muslims. After the Second World War, Britain had really lost its appetite for empire. Other than Churchill and some of the leaders of the Conservative Party, there just wasn't, people didn't want to continue to hold on to their empire. They were tired of war. They were tired of that position. And in 1946, Churchill's Conservative Party is voted out in Britain, and the new Labour Party, one of their key objectives is to dismantle the empire, and they started with India. As you know from multiple presentations, Muslims and Hindus had been living together in India for 900 years. And independence was coming, and the INC, the Indian National Congress, they really wanted to have a united India. They were not emphasizing religion at all. It was much more of a united nationalist movement. But we know that Jinnah is still working really hard to gained some real political power for himself, so he continues to lobby the British for a separate Muslim state, as well as his fellow Muslims in India. He said that Muslims would never have any equality in a Hindu-dominated India, and they even had a slogan, "Islam is in danger." While in truth, there was very little anti-Muslim prejudice in India. People had their religions, but it was by and large a secular state like the United States is today. When the peaceful efforts to gain more, opportunities for independence for Muslims, they failed, then Jinnah led the Muslim League to start supporting violence and terror movements against Hindus. And, it's not surprising then that you would have violence going in the other direction. Violence by Hindus against Muslims, so it's kind of sad that so much of this stuff broke apart because of the political ambitions of one man. So we know independence is coming. Nehru and Gandhi both refused to consider partition, which actually elevated the fears of some Muslims that the Hindu majority was going to limit their rights and independence and that kind of stuff. But the repeating cycle of violence between Hindus and Muslims kind of made partition inevitable. But Jinnah showed one more time that this is really ultimately about, his ego and his desire for power, because he agreed to drop the whole concept of having an independent Muslim state if he got to be the first prime minister of India. And Nehru and Gandhi were like, yeah, no. And so we get Pakistan as a consequence of that. In 1947, you have two separate states, India and Pakistan, declaring independence. Now, the reality is that if the Brits had acquiesced to giving India its independence before World War II, before Jinnah had the opportunity to agitate for a separate state, then there would have been no partition, and you would have had a much larger and much more multi-ethnic state, although India is still very multi-ethnic, much more so than Pakistan. Pakistan lost a lot of educated people, a lot of Hindus educated, and other non-Muslim groups who ended up leaving Pakistan. You have the greatest mass refugee migration movement in history at that point. 10 million people switched countries because of their religion in 1 year. So you had a lot of Hindus who had lived in the places that were now Pakistan who were like, I'm out of here. And some going in the other direction, although to this day, India still has more Muslims than Pakistan. When you rank countries on earth by the number of Muslims who live there, India is the second largest Muslim country on earth, even though it does not have a majority Muslim population. There are it's 250 million Muslims in India today. India, again, is still a very multi-ethnic society, unlike Pakistan. So India becomes a federal republic that is led by Nehru, unsurprisingly. Now, if you look at the map, you can see that there's actually like two Pakistans, and we'll get to that in a moment. Unsurprisingly, this division leads to conflict. And the first trigger area was this region called Kashmir in the far north of India. It was a majority Muslim region, but it had a Hindu ruler. So it's multi-ethnic, and it had been so for, hundreds of years. And initially, it was sort of undecided whether it wanted to join Pakistan or remain with India. And it agreed to stay with India after Pakistan just invaded Kashmir and tried to grab it all for themselves. Eventually, you get a partition line. Kashmir is divided. Later on, China comes in and grabs a little piece of Kashmir as well. But it is still a flashpoint for violence between Pakistan and India, and there are regular uprisings and protests and violent crackdowns and that sort of stuff in Kashmir. Gandhi gets assassinated in 1948, not by a Muslim. He is, in fact, assassinated by a Hindu nationalist because he thought that Gandhi was being too nice to the Muslims, that these Hindu nationalists, again, motivated by that cycle of violence, really wanted Gandhi and the Indian National Congress to go after Muslims, and they didn't. And as a result, Gandhi was killed. Mentioned in a previous slide that we have this weird situation where we've got two Pakistans that are hundreds and hundreds of miles apart. And the idea there was that Pakistan was going to be the regions of India with a majority Muslim population, and that just happened to be two separate geographic areas. The majority of the population was actually in East Pakistan. Even though West Pakistan is a much, much larger geographic area, the population isn't very concentrated in the western part of Pakistan. The people were there, but they were ignored by the Pakistani government. They didn't get the resources that they really needed. And part of the problem for East Pakistan is that it was very closely intertwined economically and culturally with Calcutta, which is a major city in India. And of course, Pakistan is now not in India anymore. And so they're sort of cut off from their economic base. They got attacked by their own government when they asked for some autonomy. And because of a lot of other issues, you end up with 10 million refugees leaving East Pakistan and entering India. And that was just not a situation that was going to be able to continue. And so India finally intervened militarily, went after the Pakistani forces in East Pakistan and threw them out. And as a consequence, we get an independent country now. East Pakistan becomes the nation of Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is this unstable country. It's majority Muslim. It's very small in geographic area, but has a massive, massive population. And it's going to be a flashpoint for conflict in the future because it is a very low country. And it's incredibly vulnerable to climate change, as you can see in the image above. And that's only going to get worse as climate change gets worse. And you're going to have eventually there will be no option other than to have a massive refugee relocation movement because huge chunks of land that sustain tens of millions of people will be underwater in a few decades. And that is going to create a massive global crisis that's coming down the road at us. So Pakistan is now what West Pakistan used to be. And it's not a stable country either. They have this long series of military dictatorships. They flirted briefly with democracy in the 80s and 90s before going back to military dictatorships in the 2000s. They were a Cold War ally of the United States. You can see one of the military dictators there with John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. So we'll see throughout the rest of this presentation that frequently our allies in the Cold War are brutal military dictators. The Soviets wanted Pakistan. We know that the Russian people had been looking for a warm water port for 1,000 years, and they identified Pakistan as being a fairly weak country that they would be able to conquer, which is why they invade Afghanistan in the 1970s. It's to get to Pakistan. Now, it didn't work. Pakistan supported the Afghan rebels that were fighting the Soviets, as did the United States of America. We found a guy who was willing to go and get some Arabs to fight in Afghanistan, and so we paid him to do that, and his name was Osama bin Laden. You've probably heard of him. We gave tons of military aid to Pakistan, which understandably alienated India, right? We were giving them, military technology to be able to defend themselves against the Soviets, but the Pakistanis then turn around and they use that military equipment against India, and that understandably made India a little frustrated with the United States. Pakistan would also side with China whenever China had a conflict with India. And unfortunately, again, we will see this throughout this period. The United States is more than willing to overlook lack of democracy in the pursuit of their own interests all around the world. And things got even more complicated in the 1990s when Pakistan got nuclear weapons. India had already had them in 1970s, and so you have these two countries that are very, very hostile. The tensions are very, very high between them, and now they both have nukes. Not a great situation. We will now turn to Southwest Asia, or the Islamic world. Nationalism came late to the Arab world, and a big factor was the way that the Ottoman Empire was organized. If you recall, it was organized by religious groups rather than ethnic or racial groups. Those religious groups were called millets. And so, Arabs didn't think of themselves as belonging to particular nations. They were sort of this united group, Arabs, Sunni, Muslims. And so, it's not until after World War I where the founder of modern Turkey, Ataturk, brings nationalism to the Islamic world. And that form of nationalism becomes a model for the Arabs going forward. Now, the British promised self-determination for Arab peoples after the First World War. This should sound familiar by now. The British had no real interest in giving the Arabs true independence after World War I. And both the British and the French suppressed all of those independence movements in the mandates that they controlled. If you recall, after World War I, they broke up the Middle East into these mandates that were controlled by Britain and France. Saudi Arabia got its independence in 1932, but Britain maintained effective control over its coastline. So the Saudis had full control over the endless miles of desert in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, but not so much over the ability for them to engage in independent trade. At the same time, the United States is also pursuing its own oil interests in the region. Syria and Lebanon are more complicated because they are multi-ethnic and multi-religious, and we will see as we move through the 20th century and into the 21st how problematic that becomes. But they got their independence from France shortly after the end of the Second World War. A flashpoint of tension in this part of the world during this period is in the Palestine Mandate. If you recall, Theodor Herzl founded a Zionist movement in the late 1800s to create a homeland for the Jewish people. They started buying up land before even the beginning of the 20th century. But the Zionist movement was less nationalist and more socialist. So they were really trying to create a socialist paradise eventually in Palestine. The British had given permission for Jews to migrate to Palestine after World War I, but at the beginning of World War II, they stopped allowing that Jewish migration because they didn't want the Arab peoples to side with the fascists. That would disrupt the war effort for Britain, as well as access to important resources like oil. By 1947, about a third of the population of the Palestinian Mandate were Jews. And they were met with hostility by the local Arabs who saw them as coming in and trying to take their land away from them, even though, it was purchased legally over many, many decades. Arab nationalism partly is stimulated by this Jewish migration, as well as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is what divided up the Middle East into these mandates for Britain and France, and the Balfour Declaration, which was the statement by the British government that said that Jewish people have a right to a homeland in that part of the world. Not surprisingly, the Palestinian Arabs saw this Jewish migration as just an extension of imperialism, British imperialism. After the Holocaust, there was a lot of guilt in the world, and there was a sense amongst Western countries that it was time for the Jewish people to have their own independent state. We know that Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated in Great Britain, and the Labour Party, just as it was doing in India, was trying to decolonize. And they called for the immediate creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. They didn't really think of the Arab peoples as being distinct on a national level, meaning that they didn't notice or recognize any distinctions between the Arabs who lived in Syria, the Arabs who lived in Jordan, the Arabs who lived in Palestine. Now, there were, but this is just the British view of things. And so they called for just moving the Palestinian Arabs into one of those other countries, despite the fact that these people had lived on that land for 2,000 years. So you get, there's a lot of agitation, and you get Zionist terrorist groups. When we think of the Middle East and we think of terrorism, we tend to not think of the Jewish people, the Israelis, as being the terrorists, but the Zionists were definitely directing acts of terror against both local Arabs and the British colonial government that they didn't feel like was leaving fast enough. The newly created United Nations called for 2 equal states in Palestine, one for Jews and one for Arabs. And that's what you see in this map. So the areas in white were the ones that the UN said should go to the Jewish people, and the darker brown are the areas that should be reserved for the Palestinian Arabs. And the land is divided almost 50-50. The Arabs actually, in this plan, would have ended up with a little bit more of the better territory for agriculture and things like that. That huge sort of triangular chunk at the bottom, that's just all desert. You can't do anything out there. And the Zionists agreed. The Jews were like, okay, cool, let's divide it. But the Arabs did not. And as a consequence of that, once the last British troops finally left in 1948, Israel declares its independence, based upon the borders you can see on this screen. As soon as Israel declared their independence, they were immediately attacked by all of their Arab neighbors: Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and even Iraq, which was not a literal neighbor of Israel. And the Israelis defeated all of them. Something happened to the psyche of the Jewish people after the Holocaust, and they just decided never again. And they fought like they hadn't fought since they fought the Romans 2,000 years ago, and they won. And Israel ended up with a third more land than they would have received under the UN partition. And there's this old saying, to the victor go the spoils, and the Israelis won that war. And another consequence is that 750,000 Palestinians fled Israel, and most of them ended up in refugee camps in Jordan and in southern Lebanon. And sadly, the Palestinians have been in those refugee camps for 3 or 4 generations now. They've not really integrated into the populations of those countries, unfortunately. The Arab states saw the Israelis as usurpers and agents of the West. They didn't think that Israel had the right to exist. And in fact, many Arab states still, to this day, refuse to acknowledge that Israel has a right to exist. Moving west to Egypt. After World War II, Britain finally withdrew from Egypt. Egypt was allegedly an independent country going back to the 19th century, but as long as the British had troops in Egypt, they were in effective control. But when they left the Egyptian king, who was very open to Britain, who was kind of like their puppet. But the puppet didn't last very long, because in 1952 there was a military coup by some younger officers in the army, and it was led by this guy who you can see on the screen named Gamal Abdel Nasser, and we will just call him Nasser for forever. Nasser did what populists or quasi-fascists do. He broke up the large estates and redistributed the land to the peasants, which of course made him very, very popular. He modeled an agricultural plan on Stalin's, which is not the guy you really want to be modeling your economic plans on. But he had a 5-year agricultural plan. And that 5-year agricultural plan was dependent upon building a massive dam on the Nile River. And it would do 2 things. One, it would produce a tremendous amount of electricity for the country. Much of Egypt would finally be electrified in the 20th century. And it would also allow for more irrigation, which then leads to more food, and starvation, and malnourishment was a big problem in Egypt at that time. But he was going to need a tremendous amount of money to be able to build this massive dam. And for a host of reasons, both the United States and Britain refused to help finance it. That wasn't going to stop Nasser, though. And Nasser saw a source of revenue very close by, in fact, in his own country, and that's the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was still controlled by Britain and France, which means they were the ones who were getting the profit, because you don't just get to go through the Suez Canal for free. You have to actually pay to use it. And Nasser said, look at that. Look at all that money over there in the Suez Canal. And he invaded the canal zone and took over the Suez Canal in 1956. This precipitated what we refer to as the Suez Crisis. Nasser took it, and that allowed him to be able to use those resources to help him build this dam that he wants to build. Britain and France were not cool with that at all. They really liked getting all of the revenue from the Suez Canal, and that led them to invade Egypt. And in fact, they brought Israel along for the ride. And their goal was to get control of the canal zone again. And Israel wanted to grab some land near the canal zone as well. But proving that we have moved beyond the period where the United Kingdom is one of the dominant powers in the world, the U.S. kind of forced them to back down. They were irritated because Britain just took action without talking to the Americans first. And you get this rare situation where both the United States and the Soviet Union were together calling for Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw from the canal zone, as long as Egypt gave an assurance that the canal would always be open to all nations. You still have to pay to use it, but Egypt committed to never shutting down the canal. Now, that actually did happen once, but that was the plan in the 1950s, is that the canal would always be open to all nations. And part of that deal meant that Egypt finally got its money to be able to complete the dam, and it came from the Soviets this time. And this whole experience made Nasser a hero, not just in Egypt, but all across the Arab world, because he was the first guy to stand up to these imperial powers and win. After Nasser's success, the other North African nations of Tunisia, Morocco, Sudan, and Libya all gained their independence as well. The one nation where it was a little bit harder was Algeria. France really wanted to hold on to Algeria because there were a lot of French settlements there, but they didn't hold on for very long. We also see the Arab nations turning more towards the USSR after the United States briefly invaded Lebanon in the late 50s in order to be able to support their preferred government in Lebanon. In 1954, we have the formation of an Arab nationalist party that actually is in several different nations. It's called the Ba'ath Party, and we see the Ba'ath Party rise to prominence in Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. Arab nationalism was a little bit of a problem in Syria, though, because Syria is a majority Arab country, but the ruling family in Syria they're Muslims, but they're not Arabs. They're an ethnic group called the Alawites. And so part of the dynamic in Syria, even in the last, in recent years in the Syrian Civil War, is the fact that this minority ethnic group has been ruling over the Arab Muslims of Syria for decades. In 1964, a relatively insignificant water dispute leads to the formation of an organization called the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, with a lot of backing from the Arab states. And for the first several decades of the PLO's existence, it's a terrorist group and nothing else, although that changes in the 1990s. There were more wars between the Israelis and the Arab states, though. In 1967, you see Egypt and Syria and Jordan all preparing to attack Israel again. Israel received the intelligence that this war was coming, and they made a decision to simultaneously attack all three of those nations at the same time, which they did, and they defeated them all in less than a week, which is why it's called the Six-Day War. Israel ended up taking land from all three and still holds the land that they took from Jordan and Syria in 1967. The UN demanded that Israel withdraw, but they don't have the ability to really back up their demands. But they also asked all of the Arab states to acknowledge Israel's right to exist, and many of those nations still have not done so decades later. 6 years after the Six-Day War, you have the Yom Kippur War. Now, Yom Kippur is a religious holiday. It's one of the most important religious holidays in Judaism. And Egypt and Syria, Jordan didn't participate this time, Egypt and Syria decided to go after Israel on one of their holiest holidays. And after some initial setbacks where Israel was a little kind of on the ropes, with a little bit of tactical support from the United States, not military support, we didn't have troops on the ground, Israel was able to defeat Egypt and Syria. We live in a very interconnected world at this point, and the Yom Kippur War led to an economic crisis in the United States. There's this organization called OPEC, which is it's a coalition of nations that produce a lot of oil. It was formed in 1960 by the Saudis, but there are countries all over the world that were a part of OPEC and still are. OPEC still exists. But to punish the United States and Western Europe because they supported Israel during the most recent war, OPEC cut off oil shipments to all of those countries and also Japan for some reason. This creates a massive economic crisis all over the world. The Saudis grabbed all of the Western oil companies in Saudi Arabia and nationalized them, meaning they took over and then started taking all the profits. Oil prices quadrupled. And what we have is a reverse of the flow of capital. Instead of money and resources flowing out of the Arab countries, now you see capital flowing in to Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, because they quadrupled the price of oil. You ended up with huge lines to get into gas stations in the United States, which you can see there. And this is in 1973, 1974. This killed off big American cars and opened the door for companies like Honda and Toyota to start selling cars in the United States because their cars were a lot more fuel efficient. It also stimulated domestic oil production. When we were getting massive amounts of oil very inexpensively from Saudi Arabia, we weren't going after oil within the United States quite as much. That changes in the 1970s, and you start to get a lot more oil production, including into Mexico. By the 1980s, overproduction split OPEC. Once you're overproducing, then the value is going to go down. And it actually ended up devastating the economies of Mexico and Nigeria and Venezuela. Mexico isn't even in OPEC anymore. The Saudis became massively wealthy, but ultimately the capital does come back to the West because one of the things that the Saudis do with their massive wealth is start buying huge amounts of weapons, and they're buying all of that stuff, or almost all of that stuff, from the United States. For Egypt, this constant state of warfare was really kind of unsustainable and didn't really make economic sense anymore. So after the completion of this huge dam on the Nile River that that Nasser had been trying to create, their agricultural output doubled, which is what they were going for, but population growth was still running ahead of Egypt's ability to feed itself. And so it needed to make some economic and political changes. At the same time, because of this oil crisis, the U.S. is now very, very interested in brokering peace in the Middle East. And probably President Jimmy Carter's biggest achievement on the international stage is what's called the Camp David Accords. Camp David is this retreat for presidents in Maryland. And so Carter brought the leaders of Egypt and Israel to Camp David to broker this peace deal. And the deal was that Israel agreed to return the land that it took from Egypt in 1967, and Egypt agreed, finally, to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. As soon as that happened, the Americans agreed to increase spending or aid to Egypt, both military and humanitarian aid, and they matched the military spending with that given to Israel, right? And so now Egypt kind of becomes more of an American client state than a Soviet one, right? Because the Soviets gave them a lot of money to help build that dam. But it was a pretty unpopular thing in Egypt. The Egyptian people weren't thrilled about it, nor was the military, because the Egyptian leader who signed those accords, Anwar Sadat, was killed by his own troops in 1981, and you can kind of see that happening there in the lower image. Another country that was in really rough shape during this period was Lebanon. Lebanon, as you can see from the map, is multi-ethnic and a multi-religious nation. So it's about 40% Shia Muslim, about a quarter Sunni Muslim, about a quarter Christian, and then there's this other group called the Druze, and I would have to have a whole presentation to explain the Druze to you, so I'm not going to do that right now. Lebanon was very culturally influenced by France. It had been a part of one of the French mandates. Beirut, before their civil war, used to be often referred to as the Paris of the Levant, Levant being just yet another name for the Middle East. But all of those wars between the Arab states and Israel, that created a massive Palestinian refugee crisis, and that destabilized Lebanon, because at that time Lebanon had a Christian minority government, and so the uprising of the different religious Arab groups led to a civil war starting in 1975, and not only did you have all of the various local ethnic and religious militias, as well as the official Lebanese army that was sort of disintegrating at that point, you also have outside countries getting involved in the Lebanese Civil War. Iran gets involved to advocate for the Shia. Israel is involved because of the fact that the PLO was using southern Lebanon as a base of terror attacks. Syria was very interested in what was happening in Lebanon, and the Americans have to get involved in everything. Because of the PLO, Israel invaded southern Lebanon in 82 and stayed right into the 21st century. And we arrived in 1983 and thought we were going to be the big boys on the block. And terrorists blew up the barracks where our Marines were staying in Beirut and killed 241 of them. And that was enough to make the American people say, hey, why the heck are we in Lebanon? And so we pulled out as a result of that. The war finally ended in 1990, and you have a slow rebuilding process begin during that period. But Lebanon is still a really unstable country, and it's been worse since the Syrian civil war started in the early 2010s. We'll turn now towards Iran. Remember, Iran had been called Persia for a long time, although Persia is actually a Greek term. They formally renamed themselves Iran in the 20th century. But Iran was divided into spheres of influence between Britain and Russia. So while it wasn't properly colonized, it was definitely a country that was under influence of Western countries. As a reminder, Iranians are not Arabs. They have been culturally distinct for more than 2,000 years. And again, I think we've talked about this before, but most Iranians are Shia Muslims, not Sunni Muslims. The founder of modern Iran in the 1930s was a guy named Shah Reza Pahlavi. Shah means king. And he supported Hitler in the 30s. And, consequently was removed by the British in 1941, which is probably the right play. After World War II, though, Americans, as we see all over the world, Americans are replacing the British as the leading foreign power. And you start to have a Cold War rivalry in Iran. And so any government that seemed like it might be open to communism or socialism was a government that was probably going to get overthrown by the Americans, which is exactly what happened in Iran. The democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in the early 1950s, and instead of having a free and independent government, a republic, the Americans just installed Shah Reza Pahlavi's son as the new Shah, and now we have Iran as an American client state. The Shah was detested in Iran. He was seen as an American puppet because he was an American puppet. The Shia clergy in particular were bitterly opposed to the Shah because they saw the Shah as someone who was perpetuating Western culture, which they felt was morally bankrupt. Initially, the Shah responded to that hostility with repression. When repression didn't work, he shifted to making concessions to the Iranian people. There was this really revered figure named the Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah is a title, and he's this exiled Shia clergyman, and he kind of became the symbol of resistance to the Shah. You can see the Ayatollah; all those dudes are holding up pictures of the Ayatollah. And, in the late 70s, the Shah was dying. He was very, very ill, and he fled Iran in 79, which paved the way for the return of the Ayatollah, which also launched the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The Ayatollah Khomeini called on all Muslims all over the world, regardless of different types of Islam, to rise up and overthrow their corrupt leaders, whether they were actual colonies or the corrupt Western-aligned political leaders of those countries. Khomeini kind of combined Islamic fundamentalists, which he absolutely was, but it was also, in a way, a nationalist movement. It was a nationalist uprising. He activated Iranian nationalism. And in the enthusiasm for the Iranian Revolution, a lot of people broke into the American embassy, and they actually ended up taking 52 American hostages and holding on to them for a year and a half from, like 1979 to 1981 or something like that. Iran's chief rival in this period, though, actually wasn't even the United States. It was their neighbor, Iraq. Iraq was under control of a brutal dictator named Saddam Hussein. He came to power in 1968. He was a Ba'athist, right? The Arab Nationalist Party, and he's secular. He was a Sunni Muslim, but religion was not a factor in Saddam's regime. He had to rule multiple ethnic and religious groups, and that's also part of the reason why he couldn't lean into religion very hard. But he was somebody that was actually supported by the United States in the 70s and 80s, mainly because he was both anti-communist and anti-Iranian. And so we gave Iraq a ton of military aid in that period. Saddam decided to launch a war against Iran in 1980, and we liked that too because the Islamic Revolution had just happened and we didn't like Iran. And so we thought it was great that Saddam would start this really brutal, horrific war. Saddam was worried that this new fundamentalist Islamic Iran might induce the majority Shia population in Iraq to rise up. Amongst the Arabs, the largest religious group in Iraq was actually Shia. Most Arabs are Sunni Muslims, and it's the Iranians that are Shia, but there is a sizable Shia Arab population in Iraq, and they presented a threat to Saddam, especially if they're being activated, religiously. This war really divided the Islamic world down Shia-Sunni lines, and ultimately it was a stalemate. It was a horrific war. Saddam used chemical weapons on not just Iranians, but his own people as well, that he saw as not sufficiently loyal. So the war sort of ends as a stalemate in 1988, but Saddam's not done. Saddam decides to invade this tiny country called Kuwait in 1990, mainly to grab the oil reserves because there's a tremendous amount of oil in Kuwait. And we didn't like that. So Saddam went from being our friend to being our enemy, and we created this huge international coalition to invade Kuwait in 1991, and we collectively ended up basically destroying the Iraqi army. But as soon as Kuwait was liberated, we pulled all of our troops out of Iraq. This was not the Iraq War of the 21st century. That comes later. We're now going to turn to sub-Saharan Africa and the independence movements there. If you recall, in the 1880s, the European powers came together at the Berlin Conference and divided up the entire continent of Africa. The colonizers did make a lot of investments in infrastructure, but it was really just to benefit their own empires. They built railroads and roads and telegraphs, but after World War I started, there was basically no investment in the colonies because they were spending so much money on the war. Outside of South Africa, there weren't many nationalist movements across sub-Saharan Africa, but you did have African intellectuals who were educated in Western countries who looked to try to combine Marxism with an ethnic consciousness, or sort of nationalism, really. But as we know, the national boundaries, the ones that exist to this day, that reflected imperial goals and imperial objectives, not African ethnicities, and that has led to a tremendous amount of violence and unrest and destruction because the European countries divided up the continent. Britain and France had huge demands on their colonies during the World Wars, and in fact, in World War I, nearly 10% of the French troops that fought were in fact not ethnically French, they were West African. As we know from looking at Southeast Asia, after World War II, France really did try to hold on to its empire, and Portugal and Belgium tried to hold on to their African colonies as well. It was really only Britain that was getting its colonies ready to be independent. And the first British colony in sub-Saharan Africa that had an African government to declare its independence was the Gold Coast. And Gold Coast renamed itself Ghana upon independence, and that triggered nationalist movements all across Africa. Suddenly, now that you have an independent Ghana, all of the other African countries were like, well, we want to be independent as well. And the Suez Crisis also created a desire upon the colonizing countries to just get rid of their colonies. And then, we see France and Portugal losing their colonies all across the globe. And so by the early 1960s, France's entire West African empire is gone. And by 1975, you have 51 new independent countries in Africa created. Independence movements are never easy, and all of these new nations faced a lot of challenges. One of the biggest challenges was the very borders of these countries. The borders established at the Berlin Conference, they split tribes, and they often put rival groups inside of the same country, which led to a lot of violence and unrest. Some of these countries had pretty significant white minorities, not just South Africa where they dominated, but places like Rhodesia and Kenya had pretty sizable white European populations, and they didn't want to surrender their political power, unsurprisingly. But one example that you have in 1980, there's a country in southern Africa called Rhodesia that had a white minority government, and they finally yielded to the black majority, at which point Rhodesia was renamed Zimbabwe. Like everywhere else in the world, you have the Cold War going on, and so there are Cold War struggles between the United States and the Soviet Union, even in sub-Saharan Africa. And one example, in the Congo, the United States backed this guy named Mobutu in gaining independence from Belgium. Mobutu renamed the country Zaire, which then renamed itself Congo after Mobutu's death. South Africa was a very problematic country during this period. No white minority government in Africa lasted longer than that of South Africa. They had had a policy of racial separation called apartheid since the early 20th century. And as pressure was applied to South Africa after World War II, by 1961, South Africa withdrew from the British Commonwealth, which was this sort of collection of independent nations who were trying to work together that had been a part of the former British Empire. Apartheid was opposed by the United Kingdom. Apartheid was officially opposed by the United States, even though the southern states effectively practiced apartheid until the end of the Civil Rights Movement, or maybe not. Maybe it still is happening. Racism and segregation were official government policy in South Africa. South African blacks were not allowed any political participation at all. And in fact, they were forced to live in what they called homelands, which are very similar to, Native American reservations here in the United States. They were only allowed to live in the cities if they worked as domestic servants in white households. Intermarriage between whites and blacks was illegal. It was called miscegenation. Incidentally, it was also illegal in southern states until the late 1960s. And so, there were just a tremendous amount of similarities between the apartheid government and the government of a lot of states in the American South. The main liberation movement in South Africa was called the African National Congress. It was founded in 1914 after the official racial policies started being put into effect. And they also had a civil disobedience campaign that they modeled both on Gandhi, but by the 1960s, they were also modeling themselves on the American Civil Rights Movement. The leader of the African National Congress is a guy you may have heard of, Nelson Mandela, and he was imprisoned for life in 1961, except not, because they finally let him out. By the mid-'80s, the apartheid government of South Africa was shunned by much of the Western countries. There were lots of boycotts of South African goods and products, divestiture, which means American and Western European businesses that did business in South Africa pulled out of South Africa. And so, by the late 80s, apartheid policy, it was destroying the reputation of South Africa, but it was also destroying the economy, and that's the most important part. And so by 1990, the apartheid government started having negotiations with the ANC. They freed Mandela. They repealed the apartheid laws. But by 1994, South Africa has its first truly free and fair elections that South African blacks were able to participate in as well. And Mandela became the first president of a free South Africa. And the last region that we'll be looking at in this presentation are the Americas. So we'll begin our study of the Americas by looking at Brazil. If you recall from when we looked at fascism, Getulio Vargas was a fascist leader of Brazil until his death in 1954. Upon his death, you start to see these conflicts develop between, on one side, the working class and the peasantry, and on the other side, you have the military and the wealthy landowners. As a consequence of that, you have a series of military dictatorships from the 60s through the 80s. Although by the later part of the 1980s, there are some strikes and protests, and that leads the military to accept some democracy. During this period, Brazil spent billions of dollars that they didn't actually have on public improvements, including an entirely new designed capital of Brasilia, which you can see in the image there. But it was all paid for with loans from Western banks and Western governments, and they were never going to be able to pay that back. Brazil had more debt than any other country in the 1980s, and this destabilized the economy, and it created tension with the United States because we were the ones who were holding a lot of those loans that were not going to get paid back. But eventually, this organization called the International Monetary Fund, which helps with sort of the global economy, they helped Brazil restructure their debt and stabilize the economy. Turning to Argentina, Argentina was a little bit different than the other countries in South America because there weren't that many indigenous peoples in Argentina. And so Argentina's population is mostly descended from Southern Europeans, Italians and Spaniards and Portuguese and Greeks. In the early 20th century, the government was this coalition of wealthy people and bankers and the military. After World War II, Argentina did become this haven for escaped Nazis. A lot of the Nazi hunters found their targets in Argentina. The government after the Second World War was led by a guy named Juan Domingo Perón. He was a very charismatic guy, and he had an even more charismatic wife named Evita Perón. She was a very popular folk heroine. She's very popular amongst the people. And Perón is able to leverage his wife's popularity to get more support from the middle class and the poor in Argentina. And he was even able to maintain support from the army and the political right wing, at least for a time. Although he did govern from the left. He was very interested in healthcare for the people and jobs programs. And eventually that just became too much for the military, and they overthrew Perón in 1955. And then you just get this series of military governments from the 50s all the way up into the 1980s. In the early 80s, the Argentine people really start pushing for more democracy. And the dictator, Leopoldo Galtieri, decided that nationalism would be a great way to get the people back on his side and stop, complaining and wanting more democracy. And so there are these tiny islands off the coast of Argentina that were possessions of the United Kingdom. And the British referred to them as the Falkland Islands, and the Argentinians referred to them as the Malvinas. And so Galtieri decides to go and capture the Falkland Islands. They had been uninhabited prior to the arrival of Europeans, and so they had been a British colony since 1841. And, the British government had been kind of in a shambles for a couple of decades, and as well as the economy. And the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, saw the possibility of war as an opportunity to spur some nationalism to bolster her government. So in a way, both Margaret Thatcher and Galtieri are trying to use this war for the same reason, to garner more support for their government. Most of the Western world, unsurprisingly, sided with the UK, applied economic sanctions, and banned arms sales to Argentina. Of course, we were doing this as well. And eventually you have the Argentines withdraw from the Falkland Islands. And Galtieri is deposed as a result of that, and Argentina is able to start to experiment with democracy again. Argentina's western neighbor, which is Chile, in 1970, you have a Marxist come to power. This guy named Salvador Allende. He was very popular amongst the Chilean people, and he wanted to improve living conditions for the poor. That obviously made him very popular. He engaged in a lot of what we call deficit spending, which is spending money that you don't actually have, that you take out as loans, usually to, improve infrastructure or conditions for people or something like that. It does sometimes trigger massive inflation, which it absolutely did. And in order to kind of stave off that economic crisis, Allende decided to nationalize a lot of U.S.-owned mines. And that led to the United States to cut off all foreign aid to Chile. And it led to one other thing that's just terrible, which is that our CIA assassinated Allende and installed a brutal military dictator named Augusto Pinochet. You've already heard me say the Americans are supporting a brutal military dictator several times in this presentation. It is a theme throughout the second half of the 20th century. Pinochet was a classic totalitarian, just like we studied when we were looking in the 1930s. Banned all political parties and trade unions, made arbitrary arrests, disappearances, torture, execution. This is all common under Pinochet. If you were a political dissident, one of their preferred strategies is to put you in a helicopter and go up in the sky and then go out over the jungle or the ocean and push you out of the helicopter to your death. That was normal practice under Pinochet, who was our ally during this period. Reagan started giving him more military aid in the 80s. But eventually, brutal military dictators tend to not last forever, and you have this massive popular uprising in the 80s, and that led to a Pinochet cracking down really hard on people. But this was not a sustainable situation, and finally Pinochet stepped down in 1990. In the 70s and 80s, Central America was a real Cold War hotspot, as they say. We, again, look at this, we're supporting right-wing dictatorships in Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua. In 1979, a socialist group called the Sandinistas, who were financially backed by the Soviets, took power in Nicaragua. Nicaragua had been this brutal right-wing dictatorship, but you have this new leader, a guy named Daniel Ortega. You can see him on the right, on the lower image, standing next to Castro. He did good things. He improved education. He improved public health. He increased food production. And this is like a mix of socialism and capitalism. So even though he's backed by the Soviets, this isn't really a communist government. It's painted as a communist government in America. That's all we heard all throughout the 80s, is these horrible communist Sandinistas, even though they were still also practicing capitalism. So we supported this right-wing militia group called the Contras. And their goal was to overthrow the Sandinista government. Ortega got aid from Cuba, as we said, from the Soviet Union, and from Sweden, which is sort of a weird country to be thrown into that mix. There was a huge political scandal in America in the late 1980s because our government was illegally funneling money to pay the Contras. And this was specifically banned by the United States Congress. They said, you can't help the Contras. And so the way we help the Contras is we secretly sold weapons to Iran. Remember Iran? They were supposed to be the bad guys? Well, we were secretly selling weapons to Iran so that we could then take that money that we secretly got from Iran and give it to the Contras. Massive scandal towards the end of the Reagan administration. Several members of Reagan's cabinet went to jail. Ortega finally agreed to elections in 1990, and he lost. And then he stepped down, which is what you're supposed to do when you lose elections. And Ortega actually did it. So this horrible, communist, evil guy agrees to hold elections and then steps down afterwards. Doesn't really sound all that evil, actually. And he's a good enough guy that, you have democracy, more or less, in Nicaragua. And Ortega ran for president again in 2007, and he won. And he is still currently the president of Nicaragua. And our last stop on this long journey is our southern neighbor, Mexico. Going all the way back to the early 20th century, after Porfirio Diaz stepped down, you have a liberal government that takes over, and it actually gets support from these revolutionary figures whom you've probably heard of, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. There is this political party that comes to power in the early 20th century called PRI. And they won every single election in Mexico from 1920 to 2000, which tells you that every single one of those elections was totally on the up and up and fair and free, because, of course, that was not actually the case. Mexico's population doubles over a period of 30 years, 1960 to 1990. This also the latter half coincides with the rise of migration from Mexico to the United States, both legal and not legal migration. The middle class overall grew in Mexico, but conditions didn't really change for those rural and poorer communities, which again contributes to all of that migration to the United States. Our relations with Mexico really deteriorated in the 1970s. Not so much over immigration, that comes later. This is over drug trafficking and kidnappings and murders. And from Mexico's perspective, also obviously it was the DEA, the United States Drug Enforcement Agency, involving itself in Mexican society in a way that Mexico understandably didn't really want. There's a horrible earthquake in Mexico City in 1985. It killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people and really kind of devastated Mexico's economy. And if you recall, when we were looking at OPEC, this is a period where OPEC and overproduction of oil also contributed to, really, really seriously damaging Mexico's economy. Mexico's economy does start to rebound after 1994 with the establishment of the NAFTA agreement, which was a free trade agreement with the United States and Canada. Now, plenty of people will tell you that NAFTA was great for wealthy people in Mexico, but was not at all great for regular people in Mexico, and that's a debatable point. Congratulations on making it all the way to the end of this presentation. I really appreciate it, and please feel free to check out any of the other videos on my channel.